Before we dive into tonight's tale, make sure to hit that subscribe button if you want more creepy stories that will keep you up at night. The town of Millbrook was the kind of place people could easily forget about. It sat quietly in the distance, nestled among sleepy streets and tucked behind rows of oak trees that lined the sidewalks. Nothing remarkable ever happened here. No crime, no drama, just the soft hum of life moving steadily along. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and everything seemed perfectly ordinary, until it wasn't. It was late in the afternoon, just as the sun began to dip behind the horizon. The cool autumn air carried the smell of damp leaves, their rustling filling the streets as they danced across the pavement. There was a stillness in the air, a kind of silence that felt unnatural, like the calm before a storm. In one of the modest homes tucked away on Elm Street, the Miller family sat down for dinner. James, Elena, and their daughter Sophie, just another family, like all the others. There was nothing particularly remarkable about them, except maybe for their happiness, which always seemed just a little too perfect. James was finishing his last bite when he looked over at his wife. "I think Sophie's growing up too fast," he said with a chuckle. His voice was warm, familiar, grounded. Elena smiled, wiping her hands on the napkin. "She'll always be our little girl," she said, glancing at Sophie. The girl was humming to herself, twirling a fork between her fingers. But something in the air shifted. James couldn't put his finger on it at the time, but a nagging sensation seemed to prick at the back of his mind. Outside, the world was growing colder, the sky dimming into twilight. The evening settled over the town like a thick blanket, suffocating any remnants of warmth that had once filled the day. In that quiet, calm night, everything appeared normal. But that was the thing about Millbrook. Normalcy was only ever skin deep. Beneath it, something else lingered, something waiting. James Miller had always been the type to rely on data. The numbers didn't lie, and they never changed. As a software engineer, he lived by precision. Life, in his world, had patterns. His day-to-day routine, from the morning coffee to the quiet evenings at home with his family, followed an unspoken order. But that night, September 17th, changed everything. The phone's sudden shrill alert sliced through the stillness of the house. It was an odd noise, the kind that made his stomach drop before he even processed what it was. He grabbed his phone from the counter, eyes immediately drawn to the flashing red text. "Amber Alert. Child abducted near you." Sophie Miller, age 12. The words seemed to blur together. Impossible to believe. Sophie, his daughter? His mind raced, his breath caught in his throat as he scrambled toward the stairs. "Sophie!" His voice echoed through the house, laced with panic. The word felt alien on his tongue, too sharp, too real. When he reached her room, he hesitated for a moment. Something was wrong. The door creaked open, revealing the bedroom just as it always was. But it didn't feel like hers. The bed was perfectly made, the sheets meticulously smooth without a single wrinkle, the stuffed animals arranged with unsettling symmetry. It was as if the room had been staged, a moment frozen in time. Too perfect, too still. He scanned the room quickly, his heart pounding. Then his eyes landed on something, a faint coppery scent that lingered in the air. It was faint but unmistakable. Blood. His breath hitched, and he rushed to the window, throwing it open to let in the cold night air. His heart stopped as he saw the dark splashes on the ground below, the uneven outline of small footprints smeared in blood leading toward the woods. Sophie's blood. James's mind scrambled for answers, but none came. His legs felt like they might give out, the reality of the situation sinking in, heavy and suffocating. "Sophie's gone," he whispered to himself, the words escaping without control. His voice sounded hollow, as if the sound had come from someone else. He turned to face Elena, expecting her to be right behind him, but she wasn't. She stood in the doorway, her face expressionless, her eyes wide with confusion. Her lips parted, but the words that came out were nothing like he expected. "Who's Sophie?" she asked, her voice almost flat. The question hit him like a punch in the stomach. James froze, blinking at her. He didn't understand. What do you mean?" he stammered, his voice trembling. Elena took a step forward, her gaze distant, unfocused. "Who's Sophie?" she repeated, her tone soft and unfamiliar. For a long moment, everything went quiet. The air in the room felt thick, suffocating. The walls seemed to close in around him. He could hear the sound of his own heartbeat, louder than anything else. He wanted to scream, to shake her, but instead his hands shook uncontrollably. This couldn't be real. The world around him suddenly felt less like a place he knew and more like a foreign landscape, one he had stumbled into by accident. Sophie, his daughter, was gone, and no one even remembered her. The next few days passed in a blur. Each one felt indistinguishable from the last, the weight of the situation pressing down on James as if the very air had thickened. He couldn't make sense of what was happening. His daughter, Sophie, had vanished, yet no one seemed to remember her at all. James started at the school. It seemed logical. Start at the source, see if anyone could help. The principal, a tall man with graying hair, greeted him with a stiff smile when James arrived. But the moment he asked about Sophie, the smile vanished. No student named Sophie Miller, the principal said, his brow furrowing. He looked at James like he was speaking a foreign language. Are you sure of the name? The words didn't make sense to James, not in the way they should have. Sophie had been there. He knew it. The principal had spoken to her just last week at the parent-teacher conference. But there it was. His daughter didn't exist at this school, at least not according to them. Confused, James left the school, his feet feeling heavy as he walked through the familiar streets of Millbrook, now an eerie and unfamiliar place. He couldn't even grasp what was happening. Sophie had always been there. At home, he tore through the house, searching for any shred of evidence. Family photos, albums, mementos, all the things that made their life together real. But it wasn't real. Every single album he opened, every framed photo on the wall was the same. The outlines where Sophie should have been were just faded smudges, like a bad Photoshop job, or a memory erased. He moved from one photo album to the next, a growing panic rising in his chest. How was this possible? He'd held these albums in his hands countless times. Sophie had always been there, smiling, laughing, but now, nothing. His phone buzzed, another alert from the social media apps he'd neglected since all of this began. He opened them, expecting to find some piece of evidence, anything that proved his daughter had existed. But there was nothing. No posts, no pictures, no comments. Nothing that even hinted Sophie had ever been there. It was like she'd been scrubbed from the world. Even the photos he had of her in his gallery, gone, no trace, like she'd been erased from the fabric of everything that had once been normal. In a panic, he called the police. Maybe they could help. Maybe they'd listen. Detective Maria Rodriguez arrived, the calm in her demeanor betraying her otherwise serious posture. She listened to his story, but her eyes darted to the side, her lips pursed, as though she wasn't quite convinced. "I'm sorry, Mr. Miller," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "There's no missing child named Sophie Miller. We don't have any record of a child matching her description. I know this is a difficult time for you, but perhaps you're under stress. Grieving, I mean." "Grieving? Grieving?" James felt his blood run cold. He wasn't grieving, he was searching for answers, for the truth. The world had shifted under his feet, and he was grasping at threads, hoping for something to hold on to. He reached for the family albums, his hands shaking as he flipped open the pages. There had to be something here. Proof. Proof that Sophie existed. But when he turned the pages, something new and terrifying became clear. Sophie was missing. In every photo. The pages where her smiling face should have been were now blank. His fingers froze on the edges of the photo albums, his eyes scanning the images over and over. His wife Elena was there, her face as clear as day. But the photos of their family, every one of them, was incomplete. The faces that should have been there, the one that had always been there, were now a void, a disturbing absence. The images of their family warped and shifted. The edges of Elena's face blurred, her features rippling, like they were caught in a strange distortion. James took a step back, panic rising in his chest. He turned to Detective Rodriguez, his voice barely above a whisper. Look at the pictures. She's gone. She was never here." Rodriguez's eyes flicked between him and the albums. She said nothing at first, her gaze hardening, but it was clear. Something was wrong, and she wasn't ready to face it. "It's okay, Mr. Miller. We'll keep looking," she said, her voice a little too calm, a little too rehearsed. "Just get some rest. We'll take it from here." But James knew deep down that something far darker was at play. The town, his memories, his family, Everything was slipping through his fingers, and the harder he tried to hold on, the more it felt like he was being pulled into a nightmare with no way out. He needed answers. Real answers. That's how he ended up sitting across from Dr. Michael Chen in a small, dimly lit office tucked in a corner of the city. Dr. Chen wasn't like the authorities or the skeptical people who had brushed him off. He wasn't here to dismiss the impossible. He had spent years researching the paranormal, specifically cases of disappearances that seemed to defy reason. James had come to him, desperate, knowing that the answers he sought weren't going to come from the people who were supposed to protect them. Dr. Chen was a man of few words, with a quiet intensity that made James uncomfortable. His office was filled with books, files, and scattered papers, research, notes, and data that didn't seem to belong in the same world James was used to. It felt like stepping into a different reality entirely, a place where the boundaries of normalcy were stretched thin. As James sat there, Dr. Chen finally spoke, his voice low but urgent. "It's not just your daughter, James," he said. "This has happened before, and it's happening again. There's a pattern." A shiver crawled down James's spine as he leaned forward, his heart pounding. "What pattern? What are you talking about?" Dr. Chen slid a thick manila folder across the table toward him. The document inside was covered in redacted sections, the ink smudged in places like someone didn't want these findings to be seen. But James couldn't turn away. He flipped it open, his hands trembling as he began to read. Key findings, historical pattern, children disappearing in specific geographic areas. The phenomenon appeared to be concentrated in isolated communities, particularly in rural towns like Millbrook, where families would be affected by an unnatural, collective memory loss. Psychological trauma. Families affected by these disappearances exhibited symptoms of dissociative amnesia. Entire families would lose memories of the child who was gone, as if the very essence of their existence had been wiped away. Possible explanation: entities, some kind of otherworldly force, erasing memories for their own purpose, feeding off the collective trauma caused by these disappearances. The theory was that these entities thrived on the confusion, pain, and grief left behind when they wiped away a family's most cherished memories. They fed on the loss itself. The words blurred in front of James's eyes. His mind raced as he read the details, the weight of what Dr. Chen was saying slowly sinking in. There had been other children, other families. This was not some isolated incident. It was happening again, in the same kind of small, isolated towns where people wouldn't question the strange, the impossible, where memories could vanish without a trace, and no one would be the wiser. James could barely breathe. He looked up at Dr. Chen, who met his gaze with a kind of resigned certainty. "This isn't just about your daughter, James. It's bigger than that. These entities, they don't just take children. They take memories. They feed on the trauma they leave behind, manipulating the past as if it's clay in their hands. And once they erase something, it's gone. Forever." The hairs on the back of James's neck stood up, his heart pounding in his chest. His breath hitched in his throat. Sophie wasn't just missing. She was being erased from his memory, from the world. And the more he thought about it, the more he realized she wasn't the first. There had been others before her in places just like Millbrook. Children, families, all lost to something far darker than he could ever have imagined. He slammed the folder shut, his mind spinning. What do we do now? His voice was hoarse, desperate. Dr. Chen's expression softened, though the darkness in his eyes didn't fade. "I don't know if there's anything you can do, James. These forces are beyond our control. But there's one thing I can tell you." He leaned in closer, his voice barely a whisper. "There's a reason these disappearances follow a pattern, and you're in the middle of it now. The question is, how far are you willing to go to get your daughter back? Because you're going to have to confront the things that live in the dark corners of this world, and it won't be easy." James's mind reeled as the weight of Dr. Chen's words sank in. Sophie wasn't just lost, she had been erased, and whatever had done this, whatever dark entity was responsible, wouldn't stop until it had devoured everything that made her real. James felt a cold, gnawing fear, but underneath it something stronger, a flicker of determination. He had no choice. He had to find Sophie. He had to stop this before it took anyone else. 2 days later, James woke up to an unsettling knock at the door. His breath caught in his chest as he walked across the room. There, lying on the doorstep, was a small, unmarked package. His heart raced as he carefully picked it up, glancing around to see if anyone was nearby. No one. He opened the package with shaking hands. Inside, wrapped in a blood-stained cloth, was Sophie's hair clip, the one she'd worn every day. The moment he saw it, his stomach twisted, nausea rising in his throat. The cloth was stiff, crusted with dried blood. He could almost hear Sophie's laugh in his head as he remembered how she used to wear it, a small, glittering piece of innocence. But there was something wrong with it now. The hair clip, once simple and charming, seemed twisted in an unnatural way. Tiny, almost imperceptible fibers were sprouting from its edges, thin and spidery. They moved ever so slightly, as if they were alive, shifting like something out of a nightmare. James could feel his pulse quicken. What was this? The hair clip was unmistakable, yet its presence felt wrong, like it didn't belong. Without thinking, he shoved it into his coat pocket and rushed to the police station. At the station, the fluorescent lights flickered above as James approached Detective Maria Rodriguez's desk. She looked up from her paperwork as he walked in, her eyes vacant, as if she had been lost in thought. "I've been waiting for you," she said, her voice distant, hollow, like it was coming from somewhere far away. James didn't waste any time. He pulled the cloth-wrapped hair clip from his pocket and placed it on her desk, his hand trembling. "Look at this. It's Sophie's." Rodriguez stared at the hair clip for a long moment, her face unreadable. Then, to James's horror, her face went pale, her eyes widening in a way that made his stomach drop. "I didn't see this," she said, her voice shaking. She darted her eyes between James and the clip, confusion and fear battling for dominance in her expression. James blinked. "What?" He leaned forward, trying to process what was happening. He looked back down at the desk and his breath caught in his throat. The hair clip was gone. Where did it go? James's voice cracked as panic surged within him. He searched the desk, the floor beneath it, the wastebasket beside Rodriguez's chair. It was as if the clip had evaporated into thin air. Rodriguez stood up abruptly, backing away from him, her hands shaking. "What are you talking about? There's nothing here." Her voice was flat, devoid of any emotion. James's mind spun, disbelief flooding his senses. What the hell was going on? He turned in frantic circles, his heart hammering in his chest. "It was right here! I put it right here!" He grabbed her by the shoulders, shaking her. "Don't you see it? The clip! It was there!" Rodriguez's eyes flickered with something, an emotion, maybe fear, but it disappeared as quickly as it came. "There's nothing here, James," she repeated, her voice unnervingly calm. "You need to leave now." James stumbled backward, his mind racing. He felt like he was losing his grip on reality. He looked at Rodriguez one last time, the sharp edge of confusion digging into his brain. Her gaze was empty, distant, like she wasn't seeing him at all. With one final, frustrated glance around the room, James bolted out of the office, his mind spinning, his thoughts chaotic. He needed to get answers. He needed to find out what was happening to Sophie, and why the world around him was starting to warp and bend in ways that couldn't be explained. Desperation drove him to seek out Martha Henshaw, an elderly woman who'd lived in Millbrook longer than anyone else he knew. Rumors of her strange knowledge had circulated through the town over the years, whispers of a woman who saw things others couldn't. Some even said she'd witnessed children vanish like Sophie, with memories of them erased entirely. She was his last hope. When James arrived at her house, it seemed even darker than the last time he'd passed by. The windows, obscured by thick curtains, barely let in the evening light. The air was dense, heavy with something he couldn't name. He knocked on the door, the sound hollow in the silence. "Martha?" he called. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a dimly lit room. Martha sat in a chair, her back hunched, her hands folded in her lap. Her eyes were closed, but her lips moved in constant mutterings. She seemed lost in thought, or perhaps in something else entirely. "Martha?" James asked again, stepping inside cautiously. Her head snapped up, and the moment her gaze met his, something inside him recoiled. Her face, it wasn't right. It rippled, liquid flowing beneath skin, shifting and warping in grotesque ways. Her features stretched and contorted, as though her face was a mask that didn't quite fit. Before he could react, her voice came, low and resonant, but not her voice. It was deeper, more ancient, as if the words had been buried for centuries and were now clawing their way into the present. Some memories are not meant to be remembered. The words echoed in his mind long after they were spoken, sending a shiver down his spine. James staggered backward, his eyes wide with terror, but the room continued to warp around him. The furniture shifted, the shadows deepened, and the floor felt like it was tilting beneath him. He reached out for support, his fingers brushing against the cold wood of the wall, but it felt wrong. Like the room itself was alive, pushing against him. Martha's form twisted in the corner of his vision, her eyes now black voids, staring at him as if she could see through him. Her voice came again, echoing and distorting, making it almost impossible to understand. "You cannot escape it." The dizziness hit him like a punch, and the room spun. His vision blurred, his body numb as if the very air had thickened, suffocating him. He felt a pull, an invisible force trying to drag him closer to her, closer to that twisted face, but something in him snapped. He broke away, stumbling out of the room, his breath ragged, his legs weak. Every step felt like wading through thick fog. His mind was racing. What had just happened? What did she mean? By the time he made it out of her house, his heart was hammering. His body was trembling, but it wasn't just fear. It was something deeper, something that made him question his very sanity. He didn't look back as he sprinted down the path, his mind reeling with the weight of what he'd just experienced. Whatever was happening to Sophie, whatever forces were at work here, they were beyond anything he could have ever imagined. James wandered through town in a haze, his mind a storm of paranoia and desperation, searching for any place that might hold a clue to Sophie's existence. Then he saw her. A glimpse, just a flicker in the crowd. Sophie. She stood at the edge of the sidewalk, her expression unreadable. Her eyes met his, and in that instant, James felt everything crash down on him. It wasn't just Sophie looking back at him. Something else lurked behind those familiar eyes. Something vast and ancient, stretching across places he couldn't name. A presence that had always been there, just beyond the edges of his perception. He took a step forward. Sophie tilted her head slightly, as if she recognized him, but there was no relief, no joy, just a quiet understanding, a knowing. Then she was gone. One blink, and the space where she had stood was empty. The crowd moved as if she had never been there at all. James's breath hitched. He turned, searching, pushing past confused strangers, but there was nothing, no trace of her. He had seen the truth. Sophie wasn't just missing. She had crossed over. She had become part of something else, something far beyond what human minds could comprehend. He stumbled home in a daze, his thoughts unraveling. Elena was in the living room when he walked in, staring at the TV. A cooking show played, the sound low, but she wasn't really watching. Her hands rested in her lap, her expression neutral. James swallowed, his throat dry. "Where's Sophie?" Elena turned to look at him, unblinking. "Who's Sophie?" The room seemed to constrict around him. His pulse pounded in his ears. He staggered back, gripping the doorframe. "Elena, our daughter, Sophie. Where is she?" Elena's brow creased, but it was the confusion of someone hearing nonsense. "James, we don't have a daughter." His stomach twisted. He grabbed his phone, scrolling frantically through contacts. His sister, his parents, his old friends. The names that should have been there weren't. The pictures in the house had changed. The framed family photos, where Sophie had once been smiling, her arm draped around his shoulder, were different. Some were missing entirely. Others were wrong, subtly warped, as if someone had tried to fix them but didn't know what belonged there. His own handwriting, in the margins of old notebooks, looked incomplete, sentences trailing off where he had once written her name. His memories fought against it, but they were slipping, unraveling thread by thread. Sophie hadn't just disappeared. She had been erased. Days passed, but James no longer counted them. He drifted through Millbrook like a ghost, the weight of an unbearable truth pressing down on him. He passed through the same streets, the same intersections where he had once held Sophie's hand, walked past neighbors who now glanced at him like a stranger. They didn't know him. They never had. The town remained unchanged. Its quiet suburban hum, the distant laughter of children playing in the park, the dull murmur of conversations in cafes. But James could feel the wrongness beneath it all. A hollow space where his family should have been. The memories were slipping. He sat on a park bench, hands clasped together, staring at the empty swing set where Sophie had once played. He knew, she had been there. He could almost hear her laughter, almost see the way her hair caught the sunlight when she tilted her head back. But the longer he sat there, the harder it was to hold on to the details. The sound of her voice dulled, the color of her eyes blurred, the exact shape of her face melted into indistinct shadows. And then, the worst part. James lifted his hands, staring at his fingers. For a moment he wasn't sure they belonged to him. His name, his own name, felt distant, like something he had overheard rather than something he had lived with his entire life. Panic surged in his chest. He grabbed his phone, scrolled through his contacts, blank, no messages, no calls, no saved numbers he recognized. His home address, gone. His work history, erased. The sound of Elena's voice, slipping. A sick, trembling dread settled in his gut. It wasn't just Sophie who had been erased. It was all of them. The Miller family wasn't missing. They had been removed. A week later, on the outskirts of Millbrook, heavy rain had washed the forest clean. A local jogger cutting through the woods came to a sudden stop when he spotted something in the clearing ahead. 3 figures. They were sprawled in the damp earth, limbs twisted unnaturally. Their bodies, decomposing far too quickly for the short time they'd been there, were barely recognizable. Skin gray, features distorted, as if something had drained the life from them in a way beyond nature's decay. A call was made. The police arrived. Detective Maria Rodriguez stood over the bodies, her face pale. There was something familiar, something clawing at the edges of her mind as she stared at the man's lifeless face. She felt like she should know him, like she had known him. But the memory slipped through her fingers like water. The forensic team collected what little evidence remained, but the rain had erased most of it. No signs of a struggle, no footprints, no identifying documents, no missing persons reports matching them had ever been filed, no records of them existed. And yet, as Rodriguez looked down at the man's face, a cold shiver ran down her spine. She turned to one of the officers. "Who found them?" "Anonymous tip," he replied. Rodriguez frowned. "Anonymous?" The officer nodded. "No name, no number, just said we'd find bodies here." A long silence stretched between them. Finally, Rodriguez exhaled, rubbing her temples. "All right, file them as John and Jane Doe." She turned away, but for some reason her feet felt heavy. The case was closed before it had even begun. And by the time she drove away, the unease in her chest had already begun to fade. By morning, she wouldn't remember why she felt unsettled at all. 3 days later, a small brown envelope was delivered to Dr. Michael Chen's office. It had no return address, no sender, just a single handwritten name on the front, Dr. Michael Chen. Inside was a single sheet of paper, yellowed and brittle. On it, scrawled in jagged handwriting, was a warning. "They found me too." Underneath the note was a photograph. It showed a man standing in Chen's office, holding up a document, the one listing unexplained disappearances dating back to the 1980s. But something was wrong. Chen's hands trembled as he examined the picture. The man's face was blurred. His body was faded, half-transparent, as if he was vanishing from the image itself. Chen turned the photograph over. There, scribbled hastily on the back, were 3 final words: "I am next." That night, Chen didn't sleep. By morning, his office was empty. His research, his files, his entire existence wiped clean. No one in Millbrook remembered him. No one spoke his name. And by the time the sun rose, neither did he. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more creepy stories. Stay safe, and see you in the next nightmare.